Well, wow, it's an incredible privilege to open up this Congress for you all. I'm going to be talking about the roots of pediatric palliative care, and I'll just note that this discussion, this talk, was developed in conversation with my dear friend and colleague, anthropologist, Dr. Myra Bluebon-Langner. By the end of the talk, I'll get a hang of how to change or where to point it. Oh, that was backwards. I need a little help. It's always a good sign when someone's not afraid to ask for help. Okay, so I'm going to keep my hand here. We'll see. So we just heard about roots. I didn't even touch it. That's the pointer. Yeah, that's back.
Yes.
We have to stop the clock because I only have 15 minutes.
Ask the referee to put more time on the clock.
Yes, exactly. That was too much.
Okay.
Okay.
This was the one?
Yeah?
Okay.
We'll keep trying. We're very persistent. So, as we just heard about the idea of roots digging down deep and then growing and blossoming, we are a flourishing grove, and yet we've come a long way and have a long way to go. In my discussion today, I will admit that a lot of what I share is very Western-centric, and I apologize for it not being inclusive of many global contributions. As I see colleagues like Danai Papadatu sitting here and Anna sitting over there, it is a rich history, and I share what is most familiar to me. So the apple tree, unbeknownst to me, did not originate in the United States. It originated in Kazakhstan, as I understand from Google, and then its seeds spread throughout Europe and even across seas and oceans. And now we have seen that seedling emerge in pediatric palliative care, so we will go through what has occurred. Wish me luck. Ah, beautiful. Well, our field in its earliest stages was rather arid. There was no formal field of pediatric palliative care. We had circumstances where in the early 20th century, towards the 70s actually, 1 in 3 children died. And many of those deaths were due to curable conditions that we think of now as curable conditions. And at the same time, pain was fully under-recognized in children. In fact, a lot of the time early on, it was labeled as anxiety, and it was exacerbated by the anxiety in children's parents. As one psychiatrist wrote in 1958, the reactions of these children, and not only was it not recognized, but it was really more concerning how it affected clinicians, may provoke dissatisfaction, dislike, avoidance, and antagonism in hospital personnel who care for them. It's often hard for hospital personnel to understand why these children feel so overwhelmed. Well, later in the 20th century, we did have the use of antimicrobials and IVs and iron lungs that transformed into ventilators and chemotherapy that allowed children to survive longer. And consequently, as Olmsted said in the 1970s, death for children no longer comes quickly and mercifully. We then forgot our ability to comfortably care for children at end of life, we lost that expertise as we strove for curing and continuing life. Well, Dame Cicely Saunders, Dr. Cicely Saunders, needs no introduction to this audience. As a almoner, nurse, and physician in the UK, she really planted the seeds of what we now know of as palliative care by introducing the world really to the concept of total pain, physical, psychological, social, and spiritual. And those seeds took root in pediatrics as well. We had the opportunity to hear first in a transformative movement, in a grass seeds movement, from fairly charismatic leaders, as we do hear about in other transformative movements. If we think back to the 60s and 70s, when there was the women's movement or the anti-war movement, there was a grassroots call for change. And that call was first elucidated by some amazing leaders, especially writers and observers of the experience of our children and their families. So first, again, my dear colleague, Dr. Myra Bluebon-Langder, in 1978, as an anthropologist, bore witness to the experience of the private worlds of dying children. And she documented for us that indeed children do express and experience pain, but also experience suffering across the myriad of domains that were named by Cicely Saunders. And she also showed us that in their experience of distress, it often remained hidden. And as clinicians and parents and children interacted, she named the concept of mutual pretense. It was a don't ask, don't tell kind of philosophy. And Barbara Storks, as an example, in 1995, wrote Arms Full of Time. And that armfuls, she corrects me all the time, of time, the psychological experience of the child with a life-threatening illness. She really brought forward the hearts and minds of these children through her observational and interactive play work with these children. And in her book, she describes various different expressions that these children said. And here's a 4-year-old child who can anticipate that he won't grow up. I just wish that I had armfuls of time. And there's Betty Davies, who also showed us the invisible lives of siblings of children who died. Her work in The Shadow of the Sun, the experience of sibling bereavement in childhood, showed us that often these children suffer in isolation. She writes, experiencing the death of a brother or sister nearly always impacts on surviving siblings, although with varying intensity, and creates shadows in the sunshine of their lives. Like shadows, the effects of sibling bereavement lengthen and shorten, darken and fade, come and go. Well, these are just a few examples of the books that have been written and have sustained the test of time. And there are 3 books that I recommend to all trainees in pediatric palliative care to fully understand the experience of children and their families. And these books led to blossoms and ideas around the field. And at the same time, we had systematic change and structures being put into place, at times mirrored by what was happening in the adult world. In 1982, Sister Frances Dominica Ricci established the first children's hospice in the UK. And, as we heard, someone who I see as a true role model for my career, in 1986, Dr. Ann Goldman established the first hospital-based pediatric palliative care service at Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children. And she defined what pediatric is to this day. The team does not confine itself to terminal care, but by choice takes in supportive care at all stages of the child's illness, from diagnosis, during treatment, at relapse in the case of children with cancer, terminal care, and during bereavement. At all stages, the care team, the interprofessional care team, focuses on the management of physical symptoms, psychosocial support, and liaison with the community. And now we have pediatric palliative care programs throughout the world. So we again have the growing trees, but they still need support. And in medicine, the language of affecting change often comes through our research. And people don't believe stories or clinical experience until we document them empirically. So we had to scaffold our growing orchard in order to be able to convince the larger world about the need for pediatric palliative care. And there were some early research findings that I had the privilege of participating in publishing. I'll just take a step back to note that I got involved in research in this field because of two reasons. One was, again, I took the lead from our adult colleagues who had published a study called the Support Study in 1995 that demonstrated, this was a US-based study, that across hospitals in the US, adults were dying in pain with poor communication. And so I was training as a pediatric oncologist, and I witnessed that experience in pediatric cancer care, where a child by the name of Michael was being embraced by his mother at end of life with metastatic neuroblastoma, screaming in pain, and her begging for treatment. And I was the only doctor in the hospital with no training, and thankfully was partnering with the bedside nurses who had tremendous experience, but it took hours for us to ease that child's pain, and that was unacceptable. And so we needed to document the experience in childhood around end-of-life care, and we started at end of life in these research studies. And my mentor said, just do a quick and dirty study, because we couldn't do multi-institutional studies in the adult world. And I ended up interviewing, not so quickly, over 5 years, about 100 bereaved parents. And that led to formally demonstrating that from the perspective of these parents, children experienced high suffering, and there was poor communication in that parents only came to understand that their child had no realistic chance for cure months after the medical team came to that understanding. And then we had the great work of Dr. Ulrika Kreiksberg, also a nurse scientist, who did a much bigger study of bereaved parents in Sweden, over 400 parents, and she asked the question about whether or not parents talked to their children about the possibility of dying. And about a third of parents did speak to their children and had no regrets. And about 2/3 did not. And about a third of those parents had regret that they had not done so. Opening up the conversation about how we support families to engage with their children around these concepts. There are also studies of healthcare workers, and at the same time that we published these studies, Joanne Hilden and colleagues did a study of pediatric oncologists across the US, I was one of them, and asked us how we were doing in caring for these children with advanced cancer. And we said we were doing a really good job in easing their pain and communicating, albeit we didn't have any formal training, we just learned how to do it through trial and error. And then finally, several studies from my colleague Chris Feutner was interrogating databases and asking the question of who's dying now in pediatrics or who's living with serious illness, and he really defined the concept of complex chronic conditions that may be life-threatening, and that more and more children, that population of children was growing. So we started to have blossoms, right, on our saplings of trees. Something that happened also in the United States, which again is, it documents the idea that a field actually exists or should exist, was a report from the Institute of Medicine, now called the National Academies of Medicine, in 2003, published the state of the art and science of caring for seriously ill children. And indeed, it was a clarion call to improve care across systems, to do research beyond just descriptive research, to create curricula so that we can better train our primary palliative care clinicians and our specialists. And so the field of pediatric palliative care was advanced. And we did see enormous development of pediatric palliative care, mostly in high-income countries. As you can see by this map, the darker blue areas suggest higher penetration of pediatric palliative care, but it was without the same level of development in middle-income countries and low-income countries. And so we had the development led by Joan Marsden, the founding chief executive of the International Children's Palliative Care Network, whose mission it was to achieve the best quality of life and care for children and young people with life-threatening conditions, their families and carers worldwide, by raising awareness of children's palliative care, lobbying for the global development of children's palliative care services, and sharing expertise, skills, and knowledge. And when you have an idea or a concept or a way of doing something, my daughter taught me this because I was talking to her about the apple tree analogy. She said, "You know, Mom, apple trees are very heterogeneous, and if you just let the seeds fly off, the next apple seed will mutate, and it will be a completely different apple. And that's why apple trees are grafted, in order to have a uniform taste to the apple. So this is grafting of an apple tree. And we needed to have standardization of approaches through textbooks, through curricula, like EPIC Pediatrics, through formal training in what we call in the US fellowship programs, through nursing curricula like EPIC, and all manner of standardization of our approaches, of grafting our approaches. And of course, the Maruzza Foundation first European Congress on Pediatric Palliative Care. I will just name that I had the privilege of being at this very first Congress. And when I came here, it felt like I met for the first time my long-lost relatives, my professional family. But I had no idea I had so many international relatives. At the time when we were gathered here, we had been working, most of us, in isolation, striving to improve the well-being of seriously ill children and their families, but it was lonely and frustrating and a slow pace of progress. But being together in such a Congress, which was really to this day is one of the only international congresses in pediatric palliative care, stimulates passionate individuals to be more creative and inspiring and to learn from one another. And to this day, from that very first Congress, thank you, Sylvia, I have had collaborations with individuals on almost every continent, with the exception of Antarctica. So, thank you. So here we are at the 25th. We now have efforts around advocacy, and the Maruzza Foundation brought several of us together also to think about religions and pediatric palliative care and try to sort of bring a uniform call and advocacy. We have the WHO that published standards for taking care of children with serious illness. And we had a beautiful paper that was led by colleagues here on standards, and the emergence of family voices. These are just a small number of examples that have now partnered with us to really amplify the needs of pediatric palliative care. So I'll just say that we now have fruit. We are bearing fruit in our fields, beautiful, tasty apples. We have come from little seedlings, and now we have groves. But I'm going to skip this one, but there remains opportunity, and we know that, and that's why we're here, to learn from one another, because of our need for further discovery, for further access to pediatric palliative care, for further dissemination of best practices. Over the next few days, we will see how the pediatric palliative care groves are doing. We'll inspect the roots, examine new seeds and saplings, and consider the challenges and opportunities for growth. Let us join together in this effort with deep gratitude and thank you.